All right, biology, wrapping up chapter 20. And in particular, we're starting out with 20, part C, the skeletal system, and then part D, the muscular system. Okay, so a little bit about the skeletal system. Two terms that we've talked about already in the year, but it's good to review them here, is the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. So in this diagram here, the darker colored stuff. Axial skeleton is on the right, so that's basically your skull, your ribs, the sternum, also known as your breastbone, and the vertebral column, your vertebrae. And it has in the human body 80 bones. And then your appendicular skeleton, the maroonish stuff on this one, is made up of your pectoral girdle. So that would be like your shoulder blades, clavicle, and arm and hand bones on both sides. And then your pelvic girdle, and that would be your hip bones or like your pelvis, your sacrum, and then your leg and feet bones on both sides. So appendicular and axial skeleton. In total, we're talking about 206 bones total in the human body. And this would be a typical long bone in particular, looks like this is the femur. But just some of the terms that come up here. There's the epiphysis, and that here you have proximal epiphysis and then distal epiphysis. You might recall from the last video those terms proximal and distal. Proximal would be closer to the trunk, distal farther away from the trunk. And the epiphysis is the end part. So this is the end part that is closer to the trunk, the proximal epiphysis, and then the distal epiphysis, the end part that is farther away. And then the long shaft in between is the diaphysis. That's that term there. So epiphysis, the ends, diaphysis, the shaft or the long part. Then this line right here is the epiphyseal line, and it would be called the epiphyseal line in the epiphyseal line in an adult. In a child, it would be the epiphyseal plate, or also known as the growth plate. And that is where the reproduction of cells takes place that lengthens the bones as you grow. And then once you're done growing, the growth plate undergoes some changes, and we no longer refer to it as the epiphyseal plate, and it's just a thin line, the epiphyseal line. So that's that. And then spongy bone. So there's spongy bone and compact bone. And the compact bone is toward the outside of the bone. And as the name implies, it's very dense, very sturdy, very strong, compact. And then inside of the compact bone is the spongy bone. So, like here, this label, you have compact bone, that's toward the outside. And then inside, in the middle part, is the spongy bone. And the spongy bone is vascularized, very highly vascularized, vascularizes and has a lot of blood vessels, a lot of blood flow to it. And it also contains the red bone marrow. There's some yellow bone marrow also. We'll talk about those here in just a second. So you can see why it's called spongy there. Okay. And then red bone marrow produces red blood cells, platelets. Platelets are what does the blood clotting so you don't keep on bleeding. And then most of your white blood cells. White blood cells are part of your immune system. So that's what the red bone marrow does. And then yellow bone marrow, it stores fat and then also contains stem cells. So you might recall we talked about stem cells, embryonic versus somatic stem cells. These would be somatic stem cells. Stem cells being cells that can differentiate to become different types of tissue. So it's just not surprising at this point, should not be surprising, but just how complex even something like a bone is, and especially when it gets to the healing process, but also just it is a living, functioning part of your body. We usually think of bones of just like the skeleton, like it's just purely structure and that's it. But it's dynamic, it's alive. Yeah. Uh, there's one other term here that I wanted to point out. Periosteum. So the peri like toward the outside, and then oste like bone. Periosteum is the outside layer of the bone, and it's a term that will come up later. We'll talk about it later. I just wanted to point it out. And then then the different bones. So skeleton, a lot of terms here, right? At this level, at this point, we're just going to look at the highlighted ones. As far as the highlighted ones are the ones that you'll need to know for the little test that we'll have on the skeletal system, the muscular system, and then some of the major organs. So a bunch of different bones that make up your skull. The maxilla is your upper jawbone. Your mandible is your lower jawbone. The sternum is what's commonly referred to as your breastbone. That little protrusion right there is called the xiphoid process. A process is like a little protrusion or a bump on a bone. There are all sorts of different. So it like the college level, if you took a human anatomy and physiology course, for the anatomy of the skeletal system, you would probably learn most of the names of the bones, as well as different things like what different notable bumps there are, what different notable divots there are in bones, and then like where muscles attach and stuff like that. But anyway, so sternum, your breastbone, the ulna, and the radius are your two forearm bones. So the radius is the one that's on your thumb side when you're in anatomical position. So if you're standing with your thumbs pointing away from you, as in standing with your arms at your side, palms facing forward, the radius is toward the outside, and then the ulna is toward the inside. And it's really cool how the joint works. I mean, if you think about it, with your arm, you can flex your arm to bring your forearm closer to your upper arm and then farther away from your upper arm, right? Like like as if you're like pumping iron, lifting a dumbbell. So there's that kind of a motion that your arm can do. But then you can also rotate your hand. And when you rotate your hand, where the radius, like right up here, where the radius joins with the humerus is the upper arm, that bone there, that can spin. And as that spins, it like flops the radius over the ulna to rotate it so that your palm is facing the opposite direction. That's kind of the gist of what's going. It's a lot easier to explain that in person than just verbally to like show and demonstrate and kind of point at what's going on. So radius and ulna, those are your forearm bones. I already mentioned the humerus, that's your upper arm. And then just a generic term, phalanges, that's here and over here. Phalanges are basically your fingers and toes. Okay? So just that generic term, phalanges. Then your upper leg, that is your femur, also is your thigh bone, but femur is the biological name for it, the femur. And then the patella is the kneecap, patella. And then your lower leg bones, there's the tibia, that's the one in front, and then the fibula is in back. So tibia in front, fibula in back. The tibia is a lot bigger than the fibula. You can kind of see that a little bit better here. The tibia, fairly large there, and then a much more slender fibula. So that's those. Carpals are your wrist bones. Carpals are your wrist bones. Similar to that, it doesn't show up super. It kind of shows up here, but tarsals are kind of like the equivalent of your wrist bones, but for your foot. So generally speaking, you have tarsals and metatarsals in your feet, and then carpals and metacarpals in your hands. So that relates to video question number 5. Number 5, how many of your bones are in your hands and wrists? How many of your bones are in your hands and wrists? And the answer is 54. 54. That's 27 per hand. But yeah, what do we say? 206 total bones in an adult human body. So over a fourth of them, over 25% of the bones in your entire body are just in your hands and wrists, just to give all that dexterity and movement that you can do. Yep. Then just a few more here. I guess let me do these middle ones here. So your clavicle is what's also commonly known as your collarbone. That's this one right here. That's, from what I understand, the easiest bone in your body to break, your clavicle. And then your scapula is your shoulder blade. That's that right there. A lot easier to see from the back. Your scapula, shoulder blade. And then the vertebrae, there are, if you don't count the sacrum and the coccyx, there are three main regions of your vertebrae. There's your cervical vertebrae. Those are your neck vertebrae. Then there's the thoracic vertebrae. That's where your ribs are attaching, roughly speaking. And then there's your lumbar vertebrae. That's that little section there, kind of between your ribs and your pelvic girdle, well, or your pelvis. All right, so cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, and lumbar vertebrae. And those are the skeletal system terms that I'm going to have you study. Let's see, pretty sure that covers all of them. Yep. Video question number 1. What is the smallest bone in the human body? What is the smallest bone in the human body? Well, you actually cannot see it on this diagram. It's called the stapes. It looks like stapes, but spelled, pronounced stapes. S-T-A-P-E-S. S-T-A-P-E-S, the stapes. And it's one of the bones in your inner ear that helps transmit the vibrations that hit your eardrum into, helps turn it into signals that get sent to your brain. Yeah, the stapes in your inner ear. It's about just over 0.1 inches long, which kind of a rough analogy would be if you took a penny, you could lay somewhere around 20 to 30 probably stapes on top of the surface of a penny. So, single side of a penny, you could stack them. Yep. Super small bone. All right, well, video, hopefully it will play as part of this video, but if it doesn't, I'll post a separate link to it. Just going a little bit about the skeletal system and then in particular how bones heal.
If you just broke a bone, you really might not be so unlucky.
What?
Well, there's a lot of things you could injure in your body. Tendons, ligaments, cartilage, muscles, etc. And if all you do is break a bone, then let's just say it could be worse. That's because bones are one of the more predictable healers in the body. To understand why, you have to understand some bone basics.
Bone basics.
There are 206 bones that make up an adult skeleton. These bones help make up our skeletal system. They provide attachment sites for muscles and let us move by means of joints. Bones protect our internal organs, especially our brain, spinal cord, heart, and lungs. And bones support us in life. Without them, we might look like a slug. They're also what we leave behind long after death. Yet don't be fooled, bones are just as alive as any other tissue you have. In fact, did you know that throughout your life, you constantly lose old bone while you make new bone? Kids form bone faster than they lose bone. And even after kids stop growing taller, they continue to make more bone than they lose, and that's because the bones continue to get denser until they reach what doctors call peak bone mass, aka the greatest amount of bone you'll ever have. It usually happens sometime between the ages of 18 and 25. The more bone you have at this time, the less likely you are to break a bone or get osteoporosis later in life. Here is what a bone looks like. Notice that it's not a solid mass. If it were, it'd be really heavy. Instead, only the outside cortical bone is solid with just a few small canals. The inside of the bone contains trabecular bone, which is like scaffolding or honeycomb. The spaces between are filled with fluid bone marrow cells. These bones actually make our blood and some fat cells. Now here's what happens when you break a bone. The first thing that will happen is inflammation. There's bleeding in the area leading to blood clotting. This provides the initial structural stability and framework to produce new bone. Then the blood clot is replaced with fibrous tissue and cartilage. As the healing progresses, this is replaced with hard bone. Over the next several months, the bone will start remodeling. It becomes compact, returning to its original shape. Then, once you've healed enough, you can start loading on weight. In fact, weight bearing will actually encourage more bone remodeling and strengthening. And the funny thing about bones in general is that the more stress you put them under, the stronger they become. Our own body weight keeps our bones strong to some degree. Astronauts in space, for instance, do weights and physical activity specifically to keep their bones strong. If not, the zero-gravity environment would severely weaken their bones. That is also the reason that weights are so important for everyone to do, especially the older you get. This added stress on bones keeps them strong. It seems counterintuitive at times, but that's part of how knowing your bone basics will help you live happier and healthier lives.
Sportology.
Hey, thanks for watching, and make sure you check out the rest of our basics videos here on this playlist, including tendons, ligaments, muscles, cartilage, cortisone, and more. And for those of you who haven't subscribed, we're putting out all sorts of videos about the fundamentals of our body. Subscribe to see our new ones every month.
We're going to pick the 6 most common injuries that happen, and we're going to walk through what they are and what movements might hurt with different ones so that you can actually figure out what is happening to your shoulder.
Okay. That was a very brief, very general description of how bones heal, that little section about it. And it is just amazing how, yeah, the initial blood flow and inflammation occurs, and the platelets, there's blood clotting, and that kind of helps give a little bit of structure. And then how parts of your immune system come in and clear it out of dead cells that got damaged in the process of breaking, and then what happens there, and then how it forms basically like some cartilage that is the next step in the healing process, and it helps even more give that scaffolding that in that structure, but it's not super firm yet, and then how that gradually gets replaced with your regular strong bone structure is just fascinating.
If you just
Oops, sorry. While we're still kind of on the topic of the different bones in your body, video question number 4. Number 4. What is the biggest bone in the human body? And the answer is the femur. That's Femur. That's this one right here. That's your upper leg bone, the femur. So video question number 4. What is the biggest bone in the human body? The femur. Femur. Okay. So here we're getting into joints, the part where 2 different bones are coming together. And 3 different types of joints that you have. There are fibrous joints, which are immovable. So those are mainly in your scalp. You have all these joints in your scalp to enable you to be born, because fitting through the birth canal is it's a tight fit, and your skull has to be like deformed a bit to make it easier to fit through. But then gradually over the course of, I don't know, roughly, well, actually, I'm not quite sure at what point, I forget at what point it goes from being a fairly flexible joint to being a very rigid, solid joint. So that takes place. And then cartilaginous joints, these are semi-movable. This would be like the ones between your vertebrae. And then synovial joints, these are the freely movable ones. And these are the main kind of things that we think of when we think of joints. So we have types of synovial joints. Let's talk about this hinge joint first. As the name implies, it functions like a hinge. So this would be like your upper leg to your lower leg, your upper arm to your lower arm, from your middle finger to the tip of your finger, or from the base of your finger to the middle finger. Okay, so those are all hinge joints. But then some are called pivot joints, and this is like I was describing, where your radius pivots or rotates in where it meets the humerus. Okay, pivot joint. And then a ball and socket joint, that would be like your shoulder and your hip. So ball and socket allows like that full, how to put it, you go up and down and side to side and rotate, just a super wide range of motion with the ball and socket joint. Saddle joints are kind of like a combination of hinges and gliding. So gliding joints allow movement back and forth, gliding. Okay, those are mostly in your wrists, and then in the kind of the equivalent of your wrists in your feet. And so saddle allows a combination of gliding and hinging that happen. And that's kind of like at the base. So like your thumb right there is where it's described. You can move your thumb back and forth and hinge it. And then condyloid joints. And it allows just a little bit more of a freedom of movement than strictly something like a pivot or a hinge. Yeah. And then, I guess one thing I could also mention, so synovial joints are also called that because, well, a type of fluid that helps keep things moving nicely is synovial fluid. And so where bone hits bone, it's not bone on bone, but there's usually like a pocket of fluid that helps keep things well lubricated and well protected. Also, so well protected for movement, but also from impact. So like when you jump and land, the synovial fluid of the joint is part of what is helping soften that, so you don't just have bone crashing into bone, because that would hurt excruciatingly. And then in the context of the skeletal system, there's also the term ligaments, and ligaments, they're extensions of the periosteum. So that's that term that I mentioned. It's like periosteum. You can kind of see that pretty clearly here as the external layer of the bone, and the external layer of the bone kind of becomes the insertion point of this ligament here. And yeah, so ligament, they connect bone to bone. So this bone connected to that bone, this bone connected to that bone, this bone connected to that bone. And here you have a diagram of just the ligaments of the knee. So you have your MCL. A part of the reason I put this is because you've probably heard of like a person tearing their ACL. Well, that's your anterior cruciate ligament. So that would be this term here, or that ligament there. And then your MCL would be your medial. I'm sorry, I wanted to point out the PCL, your posterior cruciate ligament, but the ACL, posterior, or sorry, anterior cruciate ligament. It's one of the more commonly torn ligaments in the knee. And when it tears, it's the function of that ligament is if you plant your foot, if like you go in like, if you go to like do a lunge, a forward step lunge, the ACL is what helps make it so that when you're when your lower leg plants, your upper leg stops along with it rather than keeping on going. That'd also be a lot easier to demonstrate in person. But that, I believe, is what we have about the skeletal system. Yep. So now a little bit about the muscular system. We've seen this diagram already, different types of muscles, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. So skeletal muscle, those muscles, the main thing they do is they move parts of the body, and they are striated muscles, striated because of those lines, is what we call, and voluntary. In other words, we can decide if and when to use those muscles. Then smooth muscles are also called visceral muscles. Visceral being of or related to the organs or the tissue or the inside of the body like that. And they move organs or substances within the body, and they are smooth and involuntary. Smooth, so they don't have the same kind of striations, and involuntary. We do not conscientiously control them. And then cardiac muscle, they contract the heart to pump blood, and they are striated and involuntary. So then the main parts of a muscle, so like this would be, so we tendon there, that's a term that I don't think it does come up later. Tendons are what attach muscles to the bones. So like ligaments connect bone to bone, tendons connect muscle to bone. And yeah, so here we have the overall muscle. This would be what's called the belly of the muscle. We'll get to that later. So then it's made up of these different subcompartments, kind of, where each one of these is a different fascicle. So here's one whole fascicle here. Then the fascicle is made up of all of these separate little smaller compartments, and these are muscle fibers. And one muscle fiber is a cell. So like that's a cell, that's a cell, that's a cell, that's a cell, etc. And then these muscle fibers have in them a whole bunch of, see like the mitochondria there, mitochondria, okay, or mitochondrion, singular technically, all together has multiple mitochondria. It has a bunch of separate myofibrils. Myo is of or relating to the to a muscle. Myofibrils, and then it's these myofibrils that have these. The terms is actin and myosin fibers. They are a type of protein, and they like the myosin kind of latches onto an actin, and then the myosin contracts, or it like it does this little contraction movement, and that draws the filaments in closer together. Okay, we'll have more about that, I believe, in this. Here we go.
Muscle basics. It seems like everyone wants stronger, more toned muscles. But if you're going to talk about how to get those bigger muscles, you first need to understand the basics. It makes you sound smarter, and well, you don't want to be that guy who doesn't know his basic muscle biology, yet likes to give everyone training advice. First, it's important to understand that your muscles not only control every movement you consciously make, but they also control every movement you don't know you're making. That means muscles control the movement of food down your esophagus, they control blood pressure by constricting arteries, and they beat your heart. Based on their function and structure, we divide muscles into 3 types. Cardiac muscle, which is found in your heart. Smooth muscle, found in places like your stomach, intestines, and blood vessels. And finally, skeletal muscle, which is usually attached to bones. There's 640 of them, and they're the only ones that we can consciously move. They're also what we normally think of when we think of muscles. Now let's look at a typical skeletal muscle. Your biceps. It looks a bit like this. And the actual muscle is the red part. It connects up here to your shoulder via tendons, and down here it connects via tendons to your radius. The work of contracting and shortening is all done right here in this middle part via the muscle cells. And in anyone's biceps, we're talking on the order of 1 billion muscle cells. Now these muscle cells are packaged within bundles, in the larger framework of the muscle, and they're all running lengthwise down the muscle. Now here's the cool part. A single muscle cell, called a muscle fiber, is long. It's also packed full of these long myofibrils. If you were to zoom into a myofibril, you'd see that they're made up of little sections called sarcomeres that have this cool alternating pattern of myofilaments. This is where the real work of your muscle happens. Let's zoom in even further. You have myosin and actin filaments running parallel to each other. The myosin filaments all have these bent extensions on them. With the addition of energy and a signal from the nervous system, they essentially grab onto the actin filaments, bend to pull it along, and then release. With millions and billions of these working together, you're able to lift stuff. Now it's important at this stage to remember that there are 2 different types of skeletal muscle fibers. They're often referred to as slow twitch and fast twitch. Fast twitch muscles are optimized for short explosive bursts, but they tire quickly. Slow twitch don't have much short-term power, but are really good at endurance. Everyone is born with a certain ratio of these, but depending on how you train, you can optimize your whole muscular system for different sports. The next thing to understand is that muscles grow first by breaking down, then rebuilding the tissue. For muscle breakdown and growth to occur, you must force your muscles to adapt by creating stress that's different than your previous threshold that your body's already adapted to. Now this can be done by lifting heavier weights, continually changing your exercise, and pushing your muscles to fatigue. That's when you feel the burn. After the workout is completed, the most important part begins, which is adequate rest and providing ample fuel to your muscles so they can regenerate and grow. The reason everyone says you need protein has everything to do with the basic biology we talked about. Those myofilaments, both the actin and myosin, are just long chains of proteins. If you don't have enough protein in your body won't start rebuilding and growing those filaments, and that's where the real work is done. It's as simple as that. So there you have it, a few muscle basics so that you can be smarter and more informed when you're trying to build and tone your muscles. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I work really hard on them. I'm trying to make sure that I can pass on this basic fundamental sports science knowledge to you. And by the way, we're doing this whole sports science video in tandem with Ortho Carolina. Be sure that you check out the next video. We're heading to the gym with Dr. Major, and we're going to find out how to train smarter and stay injury-free. I mean, it's all physics, right?
All right. Muscles. Where the muscle attaches closer to the body is called the origin. Usually closer to the body, or sometimes you could also say where the muscle attaches to whatever thing is doing more of the anchoring and less of the movement. And then the opposite of that would be the insertion, and that's usually where the muscle attaches farther away from like the trunk of the body. Or you could say where the muscle attaches to the thing that does most of the moving. And then in between, the main part of the muscle is the belly of the muscle. So I guess you could kind of awkwardly compliment a guy who's really buff, like at the gym, be like, dude, you have a massive belly. Yeah, I don't recommend trying that though. And then muscles also oftentimes come in pairs, where there's the prime mover and the antagonist. So, like for example, your forearm, your upper arm muscles, your biceps and triceps. If you are flexing the biceps, is the prime mover, and the triceps is the antagonist, where the antagonist has to do a certain amount of relaxing while the prime mover does contracting. And then when you reverse that movement, the triceps becomes the prime mover as it is contracting, while the biceps is relaxing as the antagonist. And then the terms we have for muscle actions, there's flexion and extension. So flexion, you are decreasing the angle between like the two bones that you're moving. So that would be like, flexing your arm. Okay, flexion. And then extension, you are increasing the angle. You're making it closer to a straight line or closer to 180 degrees. Then there's abduction versus adduction. Abduction, you are moving something away from the midline. So abduction would be like if you're standing there and here we go, jumping jacks. When you do jumping jacks, your legs go farther apart. That's abduction. Your legs are moving away from the midline. And then when you do the part of the jumping jacks where your feet come back together, that is adduction. Your legs are moving back toward the midline. Then there's a muscle action of rotation. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Then there's elevation versus depression. Elevation moving a part of the body upward, depression moving part of the body downward. And then we have the muscular system, the main muscles in the body. And again, I've highlighted the ones that I'll ask you about later, week after next. So the rectus abdominis is what is commonly referred to just as your abs, rectus abdominis. Okay. Then there's your quadriceps. Your quadriceps are also known as your quads or your thigh muscles. Okay, quadriceps. Then there's the you can't quite see, that's a TI right there. It's the tibialis anterior. So this is the way a lot of muscles are named. In the skeletal system, there's the tibia, that's your shin bone. So this muscle is called the tibialis anterior, anterior meaning in front of or toward the anterior side of the body, toward the front part of the body. So the tibialis anterior is the muscle that is basically in front of the tibia. Or just like your shin muscle, basically, is what that would be. There's your biceps brachii, okay? And then on the back side, your triceps brachii. Brachii means related to your arm. Biceps and triceps, by the way, that is singular, biceps. Triceps, singular. Some people say bicep. That would be what's called a false. No. Biceps is sometimes what's called a false plural. It sounds like plural, and that the singular version of it would be bicep, but biceps is singular already. Anyway, so biceps brachii, triceps brachii. Then your pectoralis major, your pecs. There's your deltoid, that's your shoulder muscle. It's what raises your upper arm. There's your hamstring. Hamstring. That one doesn't really have a common term. It's just your hamstring. There's your gastrocnemius. Those are your calf muscles. Calf muscles. There's the Achilles tendon. That is, as the name implies, it's the tendon. It's where your calf muscle attaches to your heel. Achilles tendon. And then the gluteus maximus, your glutes or your rear end muscles, your butt muscles. And a couple video questions. Let's do number 2. Video question number 2. What is the strongest muscle in the human body? What is the strongest muscle in the human body? It's this one right here, the masseter. The masseter. What the masseter does is when you bite on something, that is your masseter that is flexing or that is contracting in order to create that jaw pressure. When we say strongest, what we mean is strongest for its size, or for if you just took how much mass the masseter has, how heavy that muscle is, and how much force it can apply. If you did, the mass of a muscle divided by the force that it can apply, The masseter is the strongest in the body. An average person gets a biting like strength of about 50 to 60 pounds is what kind of biting strength they have, which for the size of the muscle, that is a lot of strength. All right, so that was number 2, the masseter. And then video question number 3. What is the biggest muscle in the human body? Biggest muscle in the human body. And here's where we're talking like overall mass. It is the gluteus maximus. Gluteus maximus. If we're talking biggest in length, that's this one here, the sartorius. Muscle goes from there all the way and kind of wraps around toward the back of the knee. You can kind of see it wrapping around there. Yeah, that's the longest muscle in your body, the sartorius. But for video question number 3, the biggest muscle in the human body, the gluteus maximus. And I think that's everything that we have. Yep. So that is a quick look at those body systems. Then next video, I think we start out with the respiratory system. So I'll see you then.